Welcome to AI ConvoCast, where we bring you the latest in AI and tech innovation. Quick housekeeping. Check out the affiliate links in our description. Using them supports the show, and please don't forget to rate, review, and share if you like what you hear. Let's jump right in.
The world of AI regulation, well, it's moving incredibly fast. And this week, there's a development out of the U.S. House that could really shake things up. We're diving straight into a proposal for, get this, a 10-year moratorium on any new state-level AI laws.
That's right, a full decade.
Yeah.
The idea is to basically centralize AI regulation firmly at the federal level. It would stop states from making or enforcing their own rules.
Exactly. I mean, just think about that. No new state AI laws for 10 whole years.
It's significant.
So to understand what this all means, we've been looking at the news reports, some policy analysis, statements from the key players involved.
Yeah.
Our mission for this deep dive is really to get to the heart of it.
Yeah.
What is this proposal exactly? What are the arguments being made both for and against? And maybe most importantly, what could the real-world consequences be? For innovation, sure, but also for, protecting people from potential AI harms.
Okay, so let's break down the proposal itself. First off, it's important to know this isn't a standalone bill. It's actually tucked inside the 2025 Budget Reconciliation Bill. That's a major piece of legislation, and it's being pushed by the House Energy and Commerce Committee Chairman, Brett Guthrie.
Okay, so it's part of the budget process, which, as you know, can sometimes mean things move differently, maybe faster, maybe slower, through Congress.
Exactly. And the time frame, as you said, 10 years, a full decade from whenever the bill might be enacted.
Which feels like an eternity in AI development time.
It really does. And what this moratorium would specifically do is prohibit states and even their local governments, cities, counties, from enforcing any law or regulation that targets AI models, AI systems, or these automated decision systems.
So if a state was maybe thinking about rules for AI in hiring or, facial recognition used by police?
This could potentially put all of that on hold. It's a pretty broad stop sign for state-level regulation of the core tech.
Okay, broad pause. But are there any exceptions? Any wiggle room for states?
There are some, but they're quite limited. States could still enforce existing criminal laws. The example they often give is related to child sexual abuse material, CSAM.
Okay.
And they could also continue things like removing legal barriers to AI deployment or facilitating processes like licensing, permitting, procurement, maybe basic reporting.
So kind of administrative stuff or supporting AI use, but not regulating the potential downsides of the AI itself.
That's the gist of it, yes. Direct regulation of the AI systems would be largely off limits for states.
Okay, so what's the logic here? Why are some people in the House pushing for this federal takeover, essentially?
Well, the main argument you hear from supporters is all about preventing what they call a patchwork problem.
The patchwork quilt of state laws idea.
Exactly. The worry is that if every state comes up with its own distinct set of AI rules, it becomes incredibly complicated and, frankly, expensive for companies that operate nationally.
Right, trying to comply with 50 different standards.
They argue it could stifle innovation, make compliance a huge headache, and just generally slow things down.
That makes intuitive sense from a national business perspective. One rulebook is simpler than 50. So who's generally backing this idea?
We're seeing support from various industry groups. They tend to favor a consistent, unified federal approach because it offers, predictability, clear standards across the board.
Easier to plan, easier to invest.
That's the argument. They believe it fosters AI development. And you've heard politicians like Representative Jay Obernault say pretty clearly that Congress, not the individual states, should be taking the lead here to set those national standards.
So the core idea is streamline it, centralize it, let the federal government handle this complex tech policy.
That's the vision, yes. The hope, presumably, is that Congress would eventually pass its own comprehensive AI laws. But, and this is a big but, this proposal has stirred up a lot of opposition.
And it sounds like it's not just one side of the aisle either.
Not at all. It's quite bipartisan. We've seen, I think the number is over 40 state attorneys general, both Democrats and Republicans, raising serious concerns.
Wow. Okay, 40 AGs.
And beyond them, something like 140 different organizations have also come out against this moratorium.
That's a pretty broad coalition. What are their main worries? What's the core of the argument against this?
Well, a huge concern, maybe the central one, is that this would effectively strip states of their power to protect their own citizens from AI-related harm.
Taking away their tools, essentially.
Right. They worry that without state-level oversight, you could end up with big gaps in crucial areas like, say, data privacy or cybersecurity related to AI.
The thinking being that states are closer to the ground, maybe more responsive to local issues.
Precisely. Critics argue that states often understand local needs and risks better, and this moratorium would stop them from tailoring rules to address specific concerns about how AI might affect jobs or schools or public safety in their particular communities.
Now, I saw the National Conference of State Legislators, the NCSL. They're not happy.
No, they've been very vocal. They see it as a major federal overreach, something that undermines state sovereignty. They also argue it could actually stifle innovation by preventing states from experimenting with different regulatory models.
The whole laboratory as a democracy idea applied to AI.
Exactly, and that by blocking state action, it could leave communities vulnerable, especially since there isn't a comprehensive federal framework ready to take its place immediately.
There's also a serious point being made about accountability, isn't there? That companies using potentially harmful AI might sort of get a pass at the state level?
Yes, that's a major criticism from groups like Demand Progress. They frame it as a potential giveaway to big tech companies, allowing them to deploy AI, maybe even AI with known issues, without facing meaningful consequences or scrutiny from state regulators or attorneys general.
And it's interesting you mentioned big tech when we're not seeing companies like Google, Meta, OpenAI, Microsoft leading the opposition here.
That's a really important point. Generally speaking, these major tech players have often expressed support for federal preemption in AI regulation.
Meaning they'd prefer one federal rule over many state rules.
Correct. From their perspective, a single federal standard is just more efficient, more predictable to operate under, even if they might disagree on the details of that federal standard later on. The principle of preempting state laws seems broadly preferable to them than navigating a complex patchwork.
Okay, so we have this controversial proposal. It's tied to a budget bill, facing significant bipartisan opposition. What's the status? Where does this stand politically and legally?
Well, as we said, it's part of this larger budget package. That package did pass the House Budget Committee.
Okay, step one.
Step one. But it still needs more votes in the full House, and then it faces a journey in the Senate where its future is, let's say, quite uncertain.
What makes the Senate uncertain? Are there specific roadblocks?
A big potential one is something called the Byrd Rule. It's a Senate rule specifically for these budget reconciliation bills.
Ah, yes. Budgetary relevance.
Exactly. The Byrd Rule lets senators challenge and potentially strip out provisions that are considered extraneous, meaning they don't primarily deal with federal spending or revenue.
And a 10-year ban on state AI laws might not seem very budget-related to some senators.
Precisely. Opponents could definitely argue that this AI moratorium doesn't meet the Byrd Rule test and should be removed from the bill. So that's a major hurdle in the Senate.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
And even if it somehow navigated all that and became law, what about legal challenges from the states themselves?
That's certainly on the table. You could easily see states, especially those that already have AI laws or are developing them, filing lawsuits.
Arguing what? Federal overreach?
Yeah, arguing it exceeds federal power, infringes on states' rights under the 10th Amendment. But it's worth noting the legal ground here is still pretty new when it comes to their federal preemption of state tech laws like this. So the outcome of any court challenges would be, well, uncertain.
Okay, let's game this out a bit. If this moratorium were to become law, what are the potential real-world impacts we might see? Let's start with consumer protection.
Well, the most direct impact could be that for 10 years, states wouldn't be able to pass new laws aimed at protecting consumers from specific AI risks. Think about things like algorithmic bias in, say, loan applications or housing decisions.
Or new rules around how companies collect and use your data via AI.
Exactly. Or transparency requirements for AI systems. States couldn't enact those kinds of tailored protections, potentially leaving, oversight gaps, especially if federal action lags behind.
What about the flip side of the AI industry itself? What are the potential effects there?
Well, as we touched on, the upside for industry, particularly larger companies, is that regulatory certainty. One set of rules, potentially lower compliance costs. That's the argument.
But the potential downside?
The criticism is that this certainty might come at the cost of public accountability, especially if strong federal regulations don't materialize quickly to fill the void left by preempted state laws. It could streamline things for developers, yes, but maybe lead to less oversight overall.
This also feels like a pretty fundamental shift in the balance of power, doesn't it? Between Washington, D.C. and the state capitals on tech policy.
Oh, absolutely. This could set a really significant precedent for how the U.S. regulates emerging technologies going forward. It leans heavily towards federal control in an area where states have been increasingly active.
And what about smaller businesses? How might they fare under this kind of moratorium?
It could be a bit of a mixed bag for them. On one hand, maybe a single federal rule is simpler than 50 state rules, even for small businesses.
Okay.
But on the other hand, small businesses often benefit from state-level consumer protection laws that help ensure a level playing field. If those state safeguards disappear, smaller players might be more vulnerable to, say, unfair practices by larger AI vendors they rely on.
And it could stifle local innovation that might help them.
That's another concern. By stopping states from experimenting, you might also stop the development of AI solutions or regulations specifically designed to help smaller businesses or address unique local market needs. So that promise of regulatory certainty needs to be weighed against potential loss of protection and locally driven innovation.
It's also really important to place this in the global picture.
Yeah.
How does this proposed U.S. approach stack up against what other countries or regions are doing with AI regulation?
That's a crucial comparison. The most obvious contrast is with the European Union and its AI Act.
Right. We hear a lot about the EU AI Act.
Which is this very comprehensive risk-based framework. It applies across all the EU member states, setting specific requirements for different types of AI systems based on their potential risk level, high risk, limited risk, etc.
So the EU is achieving uniformity through a detailed supranational regulation.
Exactly. Whereas this U.S. proposal aims for uniformity by essentially telling the states to stop without immediately putting a similarly detailed federal framework in its place.
It's more about preemption than creation, at least initially.
Precisely. And it's also quite different from those other global moratorium ideas you sometimes hear about.
Right. Those are usually about pausing development of super advanced AI for safety reasons.
Yes, like a research pause. This U.S. proposal is purely domestic, focused entirely on which level of government gets to regulate federal versus state.
And that EU AI Act, it has implications beyond Europe's borders, right?
It certainly does. It has what's called extraterritorial reach. So U.S. companies offering AI services into the EU market will generally need to comply with the EU AI Act, regardless of what happens with this U.S. moratorium.
So American companies could end up juggling EU rules, even if U.S. federal rules are less developed or non-existent.
Potentially, yes. That could create some complex compliance challenges, especially if U.S. federal standards don't keep pace.
Let's dig a bit deeper into that contrast between the state approach and the proposed federal approach. It sounds like states have actually been pretty busy on AI.
Oh, very busy. In just the last few years, we've seen a real flurry of activity. State legislatures introducing bills, holding hearings. Quite a few have actually enacted AI-related laws already.
And covering a wide range of issues.
A very wide range. Things like tackling bias in algorithms used for hiring or credit scoring, enhancing consumer privacy protections, requiring transparency about how government agencies use AI. You see examples like Colorado's AI Act, which is quite comprehensive, or California looking at things like transparency and healthcare AI.
So it really does seem like states are trying to respond to specific local needs, acting as those laboratories you mentioned.
Exactly. State laws can often be more nimble, more tailored. They can respond faster to emerging risks or unique local conditions. They often provide layers of protection that might not exist yet at the federal level, or where federal action is just slower.
Okay, so that's the state picture. Diverse, responsive, experimental. Now contrast that again with the federal moratorium proposal.
The moratorium is the opposite in many ways. It's centralized, it's restrictive towards states, and it aims for uniformity by broadly prohibiting state action, aside from those narrow exceptions we discussed.
And crucially, without immediately substituting a comprehensive federal framework.
Right, that's a key point. It creates a potential regulatory vacuum, at least for a time.
So, to really crystallize the difference, state efforts are varied, flexible, potentially driving innovation, often focused on specific consumer harms. The federal moratorium. Uniform, restrictive for states, aiming for consistency, but risking regulatory gaps.
That sums up the core contrast pretty well. Now, given that contrast, let's really focus on the core arguments against this moratorium. Why is the opposition so strong and widespread?
Right, let's hammer down the main objections. What are the biggest red flags for critics?
Probably the number one argument is that it would leave Americans significantly less protected from the potential downsides of AI. We're talking about things like algorithmic discrimination getting worse in areas like housing, jobs, insurance.
Things that really impact people's lives.
Deeply. And also privacy violations from increasingly sophisticated AI surveillance or the spread of AI-generated scams and misinformation. The fear is, without state laws and state enforcement, these harms could flourish for a decade.
So it's not just stopping new protections, it could roll back or freeze existing or developing state efforts.
Exactly. Critics say it effectively dismantles state-level accountability mechanisms. State AGs lose a key tool. Transparency initiatives get stopped. It can make it much harder to hold companies responsible if their AI systems cause harm, even intentionally.
And we keep coming back to the idea of stifling innovation, but this time at the state level.
Yes, that's a major theme. States often lead the way on regulation. Think about environmental laws or consumer protection historically. This moratorium prevents that experimentation with AI governance, potentially resulting in weaker, less adaptive regulation overall in the long run.
And it just halts work already in progress across the country.
Absolutely. Think about all the state legislators, committees, advocates who've been working on AI bills, gathering input, tailoring solutions. This would just pull the plug on all that effort, potentially wasting years of work aimed at protecting civil rights or public safety.
There's also that strong undercurrent that this primarily benefits the biggest players.
That's definitely a central argument from the opposition. They see it as a huge advantage for big tech, essentially letting them operate with fewer constraints, particularly from states which are often more focused on consumer-level issues. Smaller businesses, individuals, they argue, could lose out.
And the risk of scams and abuse gets higher without state action.
That's the concern, yes. State and local law enforcement, consumer protection agencies, they worry they'll have fewer tools to combat AI-powered fraud, deepfakes, and other malicious uses if their state can't legislate in this area.
And then there's the fundamental principle of federalism itself.
Right. Many opponents see this as a significant overstep by the federal government, infringing on the traditional role of states to regulate for the health, safety, and welfare of their citizens, especially when there isn't a comprehensive federal law already doing the job. Some even question if it belongs in a budget bill at all.
Okay, so if we boil down the main arguments against the moratorium, it's really about leaving people unprotected, reducing corporate accountability, choking state innovation, disrupting ongoing work, favoring big tech, increasing risks of AI harms, and undermining federalism. There was that quote that seemed to capture it well.
Yeah, something like, imposing a broad moratorium on all state action while Congress fails to act in this area is irresponsible and deprives consumers of reasonable protections.
That really sums up the opposition's view. So given all this debate, all this pushback, what happens next? Where does this proposal actually go from here?
Well, as we mentioned, its future is definitely uncertain. The broader budget bill it's attached to has faced some hurdles and delays in the House over unrelated issues. So its immediate path forward isn't clear.
Still needs to pass the full House, then the Senate, potentially facing that bird rule challenge.
Exactly. Lots of steps still to go and significant opposition at each stage. But regardless of whether this specific moratorium passes in this specific bill,
the underlying debate isn't going away.
not at all. This whole episode has really highlighted that fundamental tension in U.S. tech policy. How do you balance the desire for national consistency with the need for state-level responsiveness and protection, especially with something as powerful and fast-moving as AI? That question is going to be with us for a long time.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, that core tension is really what stands out, isn't it? The push for uniform national AI rules versus the value of letting states tailor protections and innovate based on local needs. This proposed 10-year moratorium, well, it represents one very specific, very impactful answer to that question. And it carries potentially huge consequences for innovation, for your rights as a consumer, and just for how technology is governed in this country.
It really forces you to think.
It does. And it leaves you, the listener, with a big question, I think. When you weigh the potential benefits of unified federal standards against the risks of, stifling local innovation and maybe leaving people vulnerable, what balance do you think is most critical here, especially for a technology like AI that's evolving so rapidly and touches so many parts of our lives? What questions does this deep dive raise for you about the future of AI and how we oversee it?
Thank you for listening to AI Convo Cast. Please don't forget to rate, review, and share if you like what you hear. Thanks and hope to see you again next time.